Hello, I hope you took a nice break after watching the Elements of Art video. Now we're moving on to the lecture on Principles of Design. The principles of design are the glue that pulls together the elements of art and helps guide their use in design or a composition. And then that's a kind of nice visual to remember some of them, but they're a little bit different than the ones in the textbook. So we're going to move right along and get into those. So first we have balance, which is the state of stability driven by gravity. So you can kind of think about that as your own balance. If you're trying to stand on one foot, it's pretty hard to balance and you're not actually balanced, are you? You might have good balance, but you would be unbalanced. I've said balance too many times. All right, so equilibrium is achieved when something is completely balanced or centered, which goes right into symmetrical balance, which appears stable because the same elements are used on both sides of a composition. Here we have some examples of balanced compositions with this rectangle in the middle and the dots on either side. That would be a symmetrical composition that has equilibrium. And then you have asymmetrical balance, where stability is created using different elements on each side of the composition while maintaining overall equilibrium, which could be described here, even though these are broken up, they still kind of have the same weight on either side, but then this cube being darker throws off the balance a little bit. So there could be better examples of asymmetrical balance. You might have an element here and an element here, and even though they're not mirror images, you would still have a balanced composition. Now we're gonna move into movement, which is the way that visual attention is directed throughout an image or composition, and that can be enhanced by repetition, which could be repeated lines, shapes, or colors. Here we have some different designs that have repetition of these squiggly or wavy lines, and if you really stare at them, they kind of start to move, which could get into optical illusion, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But it kind of moves your eye centrally through that composition. Rhythm can be achieved through repetition or patterns as well, and they kind of create a tempo throughout a composition. So this wave of the rectangle, triangle, and circle kind of going up and down, that would have a rhythm to it, as well as this squiggly line and these bars that kind of go up and down. If you think about maybe like the Spotify icon, that has some rhythm in it too, which makes sense because it's the icon of a music app. And then visual path is the specific way an eye moves through a page or image because of careful placement of elements. And I included that on this slide because you can a line is a pretty simple way to move an eye across a page. And because we read, in the United States, we read from left to right, that is a logical way for our eye to move. So we would follow this line along from left to right. This infograph is another example of a visual path. It's kind of a literal path it's called career pathing. But you can kind of think about that even if you're hitting all these goals. It's almost like a board game. You're going through something sequentially, following along the path, and your eye just follows along because it wants to go from element to element. So it's pretty easy when you're thinking about designs of infographics or posters. And then we have emphasis, which is used to make a certain element or principle dominant over the others. Where does the eye go first? So this is a pretty simple example. There's lots of umbrellas. Those are all the same. But then in the middle, we have an umbrella that is pink and red and yellow, while all the other umbrellas are kind of those cool colors. So it's a little bit obvious and kind of smack in the middle. So maybe not the strongest composition, but there is definitely intentional emphasis on that particular umbrella and the eye that you can see poking out from underneath it. Now we're moving on to dynamics, which results from tension created within a composition. So a dynamic image or a dynamic composition will have more elements that compete. So maybe that is colors that are competing, patterns that are competing. Maybe you don't have unity and rhythm throughout a harmonious motif or something. But so this, you have lots of angles that are converging, and you have the competing colors. You have cool colors in those blues, and then to the yellow and red. So they're really competing. I would call that a dynamic image. And then these blue dots represent kind of a comparison. So we have more of a static composition with the blue dots in a square formation. It's pretty symmetrical. And then when you have the dots arranged this way, it's a little bit more dynamic. Your eye moves through them instead of being able to take them in as a whole instantly. So even though maybe they're both balanced, their visual interest could be different. And now I kind of mentioned that in the last slide, the harmonious feeling of a composition. You might not have that so much in a dynamic composition, but in unity, it's characterized by the harmonious relationship of elements within a design that can be created through similar elements throughout, or maybe consistency in another way. So in the left hand, we have all of those pink dots, and even though they're different sizes, they're consistent because they're the same color and they're all round. But on the right side, we have consistent size, but not consistent color. So there's different ways to achieve unity. And I'm using the same visual for variety because both can be used to represent that. So variety is characterized by the use of many variations in the elements within a design. So like I said, these dots are all different sizes. So there are a variety of sizes while they stay united through the color. And then these dots are the same size, but there's a variety in the color. So it can work really well together, or variety can create lively energy or even chaos. And maybe the goal is chaos if you want variety to create a dynamic composition. One thing that wouldn't be such a good idea would be if you had the dots that are different sizes also be different colors, because then it doesn't create as pleasing of an image to the eye. The human eye or the human mind wants to find patterns within things. You want to see the connection between these dots because they're the same color, even though they're different sizes. You don't really want dots that are all different colors and all different sizes. That can become chaotic in a not great design way. All right, and now we're moving on to pattern, which is not chaotic, it's predictable. Patterns are created through repeating basic elements. Here we have a diamond pattern, simple two-color pattern with repeating shapes. Motifs are also used to describe patterns, but they can describe the repetition of patterns. So each one of these shapes here has patterns within it. The dots are repeated. These little floral effects are symmetrical within each of these images, but then these are all repeated. So this would be considered a motif. You can kind of think of motif as a pattern of a pattern. Lots of textiles have patterns or motifs, just a lot of repeated forms or shapes or elements. And then we're moving on to proportion, which are the size relationships between parts of an object. So here are some different ways that proportion has been addressed, different ways to break up shapes by changing the colors at different points. But you can also do that by breaking up a shape evenly. These lines kind of cut right through the middle of these shapes, but they're still addressing proportion. Proportion can also be used to emphasize different elements. If you have one very large element where everything else is very small, if we kind of think about that umbrella example, if you had a bunch of tiny umbrellas and then one really big one, that would be emphasizing using proportion. And proportion kind of takes us right into golden section. Maybe you've heard it as golden ratio. It's a mathematical equation, actually, that kind of results in this spiral. But it's been used to describe perfection when we think about, some actresses or celebrities with perfectly symmetrical faces. It's what is mathematically the most pleasing to the eye. And here's an example of a composition that falls into the golden section. It's a little bit obvious because they have the swirl really drawn right in there. If you look up other examples, there are photographs that kind of follow along the golden section. If you're familiar with the rule of thirds in composition, that still falls into the golden section. If you divided this into thirds, this main section or focal point would fall into those bottom crosshairs of a rule of thirds as well. So balanced composition or interesting focal point is kind of the same throughout different areas of art. And then we have contrast, which is the difference between two things, usually kind of extreme, and it can be used to make a point. Here we have a bird that is different than the rest of the birds, so that is contrast and kind of emphasizes this one specifically. You can also have contrasting colors. Here we have red and blue, which it's a cool color and a warm color. That would be contrasting colors. It can be used to emphasize things. It could make a pattern brighter. There's many uses for contrast within a composition. And then gestalt is the overall impression or how you perceive the image as a whole. So these are some examples of images that we can see maybe in some different ways. It can describe the way you fill in information or the overall cohesion of a composition. Closure is one of the kind of a key thing when you think about gestalt. It's completing an unfinished form or shape in the mind's eye. So these are some examples of closure in designs, and these are some logos. In the USA logo, the TV channel, the S is not there, but we see it. You can see it, that says USA, but the actual subject here is just the U and the A, but because of the way the negative space is used, we fill in that information. And it's kind of interesting, like with the WWF, you complete the panda even though there's no outline there. You can see this cube. The IBM logo is pretty clear, but it's not fully there. And it's interesting to see how little information the eye will complete. So if you're just given a few points, the eye still wants to complete images that it sees. Now we're moving on to expression, which can be the emotional, cultural, or social content of a design. It's the overall message that a viewer wants to send. This is an example of an expressive painting. Because of the blue tones and the way his head is hung, you kind of get sadness through it. There's many different ways to have expression through art. It could be expression of patriotism or anything like that. And then we're moving on to illusion versus reality. So illusion is a false belief about something that you see, as well as an optical illusion that makes you think you're seeing one thing, but you're actually seeing another. So these are some examples of some optical illusions where kind of the eye starts to play tricks on itself. This is just, I think, body paint, but it's creating an illusion of depth and this kind of swirled form on a person's back. And then this is just painted on a wall. You can't actually go into these cubes, but there's the illusion of space there. And then this is a good example of an optical illusion where it goes, you see a ship, and then you definitely see a ship, and then you're not as sure about what you're seeing, and then maybe it's a bridge or something else, and the clouds blend in and become the sails, and so that's a good example of an optical illusion. This is also an optical illusion. It's kind of similar to movement, but if you stare at this, because of the way the lines wave and the colors, if you stare at this a long time, it'll kind of start to move. Optical illusions are pretty fun. You can look up a bunch of them. They're difficult to draw, in my opinion. But they're a fun way to engage the viewer. All right, and now moving on to abstraction, which is something that does not closely resemble anything tangible from the real world. It can be inspired by reality, but it is typically not a recognizable image. And then symbols are considered the highest level of abstraction. They're images that represent ideas. Colors can also be symbolic. And we'll get into that with this project for this chapter. So these are just some examples of symbols that are easily recognizable. And, you have the recycling symbol, the female symbol, the notification symbol, the Black Lives Matter symbol, and the Wi-Fi symbol. These are all things that probably before I said them, you knew what they represented. So that's pretty powerful that an image can represent an idea or something else, which is a little bit different than pictographs. So pictographs are literally pictures that mean specific words, but like recycling is a whole concept. Yes, you could say that represents the word recycling, but it's more about the idea of recycling. So it goes a little bit deeper. But that is it for your principles of graphic design. Thanks for sticking with it. You can look at just the slides if you want to go back and look at some of those videos too.